Welcome to my first attempt at narrating some notes for you. Hybrid online form of lecture/video. Anyhow, the point today. Here's our webpage. I hope you can see this. And we're going active online learning. Discussion today is in support of the notes down here that I just put up. Topic 3 notes, the transportation revolution. I'm not going to load those here because that would take too long. I'll bring something else up instead. Give me 1 second. All right, so I'm going to minimize the window and bring up the actual notes from my Dropbox. Let's put those in line. These are points I want to make sure you can understand. Our focus here is on the transport demand graph. I'm not going to read through all this stuff. Instead, I encourage you to read through that stuff with an eye towards being able to understand this final graph here. We're going to build towards this graph in a series of steps. Starting with, I want you to get a blank sheet of paper, call it transport demand. Just think for a moment, how are we going to model the demand for transportation? What we have in mind is some area of the country that is serviced by transportation to take agricultural products to market some distance away. Have you draw a demand curve. What's that involve? Well, let me grab a pencil unit here. A line for the axis. Oh, that's a pretty nasty line. Try a straight line. And a line for the other axis. What are we going to call these axes? Demand model. Demand referring to quantity will be on this axis here. Price on this axis here. And what's a demand curve look like? You say, Jim, that's obvious. Demand curves slope downward based on the law of demand. Go ahead and Google that and check your notes and make sure you understand what we're going to put on the axes here. And I will bring up our next slide, so to speak. Here you have it, the transport demand model. I want to direct your attention to the idea that we've got a high price and cost for transportation associated with wagons, which would be used before the transportation revolution. Then after the transportation revolution, here we're considering the case of the canal. And you'll notice we're actually understating the dramatic collapse of transport costs during the transportation revolution because look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ticks up to the wagon price and the canal cost is at 1/6. But think through how if the price of transportation was as by wagon, that would give us this quantity of freight demanded, QW, W for wagon. The whole point of the transportation revolution is to have the reduction in costs that pulls us down the demand curve to this quantity, QC, C for canal, and the much greater number of ton miles of agricultural freight that's going to be transported out of this region whose demand for transport we are modeling. Make sure you can get a feel for the simple idea of the decline in price, reflecting a decline in cost, and the resulting increase in the quantity of transportation. And what we want to do, of course, is to identify on our graph the two simple direct effects of reduced transportation costs. For that, we need the next slide. Okay, so I've added some numbers and I've done some shading here. We're going to say that the wagon price is 30 cents per ton mile and the canal price is 5 cents per ton mile. Hence, we have a 25 cent per ton mile drop in the cost of transportation. Let's say further, for the sake of argument, that we've got 1 million ton miles of freight being carried. The point then is that the reduction in transport costs of 25 cents per ton mile, that's a savings on 1 million ton miles, gives us a $250,000, and we're thinking of this as an annual sort of model, a $250,000 savings. And that's the area A. Pretty simple. If you've had microeconomics, you might recognize that as an increase of consumer surplus associated with a decline in the price being paid for a good. Just try and make sure you're thinking about how this quantity, 1 million tons, gets transported, whether we're talking the wagon environment or later with the transportation revolution and the much lower cost. The point to make sure you understand is that 25 cents less resources per ton mile is being used for the transportation. That represents resources that will be turned into, well, simply GDP. And A then is a direct increase in GDP attributed to the transportation revolution. Question then, what about the expansion or increase in freight carried from this QW to this QC? What sort of gains to the economy are associated with that increase? Well, for that, of course, the next slide as discussed and described in the notes, which I hope you're referring to. There we go. We've added in area B, shaded that lovely green color, to go with this green arrow to remind us that we're talking about the gain resulting from the expansion of freight traffic that in turn is induced by or caused by the decline in transportation costs. Now there's some further discussion in the notes, but try to get the idea that right here where my cursor is going up and down, we see a 25-cent per ton mile savings. As we consider the expansion of freight, we're talking about more and more freight being carried, which if you look up at the demand curve, the height of the demand curve is telling us how high a price would be paid to transport that freight. The fact that the price that they have to pay to get it shipped by canal is less, that vertical gap gives us the gain. Again, you might refer to your consumer surplus theory from demand, but in any case, the point for us simply is for you to recognize in a graph like this that area B represents the gain to the economy from the increased freight traffic, which in turn is a result of the reduced transportation costs. And our next slide will show us the values involved, the dollar values involved. Right, so there's the final slide of our set. Let me move down a little bit in the viewer there. And if and only if it helps you to understand what's going on, think about the nature of the calculation that leads us to say that this is $375,000 of gain, a bigger gain than the $250,000 gain associated with the direct resource savings. Again, the point to try and see is that this cost savings of 25 cents induces this increase. We've modeled it as a $3 million ton mile increase in freight being carried. What you need to try and understand is that the increased freight being carried is a result of more land being brought into production, which is the key result of the transportation revolution, which is discussed further in the notes. One thing I want to encourage you to do to get it, if you're going to pursue this model, and for those of you who aren't digging the econ, don't worry, you don't need to be able to figure this out. But if you want to push your understanding a bit, follow my cursor here and imagine that the demand curve was much more, we would say, elastic technically, but imagine the demand curve came out to some point like this. So that we had double, for example, the expansion of the traffic. So if instead of going from 1 to 4, we went from 1 to 7 million ton miles, for example. So we thought 7 times as much traffic, 7 times as much land in cultivation because of the transportation revolution. Well then, instead of the estimated 375, if we had twice as much of an increase, then we're talking about $750,000. More to the point, of course, is that we are thinking that the reduction in transportation costs applied to the entire Trans-Appalachian West, and so we want to refer back to our land policy segment and look at the vast expansion of first territory, but then settlement. And as you look at settlement graphs, try to recognize, hey, if there had not been a transportation revolution, how much slower would that settlement and agricultural expansion have been? And of course, that can't help but get us thinking about the Jefferson-Hamilton debate and thinking, well, I guess the Jefferson-Hamilton debate is just irrelevant because we got the rapid westward expansion, we got the transportation revolution, and yet up in the Northeast, we did see an industrial revolution and the rise of manufacturing. Anyhow, more on that later. If you have questions, please direct them to the piazza. Otherwise, that wraps it up for now. Thank you. Good health and good day.